Lifting weight over your head is one of the greatest joys available to humankind. When it comes to putting weight overhead, the push press is a great way to get it there. It combines the strength of the leg drive that we would perform in, say, a squat or a jerk with the ease of lockout of a press. Got a whole series on the natural press coming your way to help find what your natural tendency is when it comes to putting a heavy weight overhead. The push press is a little bit more formal than the natural press, and we're going to learn it with 2 kettlebells. The one-arm version, of course, a little bit easier, a little bit more accessible, and certainly worth practicing. A great way to get experience with a kettlebell that's maybe a little bit heavier than you can strictly press overhead, just so you can get familiar with that bell and be ready to press when it's time. We're going to assume that you've already watched the instructional videos on clean technique and double kettlebell skills in general. You've got the clean, you've got the lockout of a double press mastered, and you know how to do a front squat. You basically already have all the ingredients for the push press in your pantry. Now it's just a matter of putting them together in a different recipe. We'll start with our clean. About a foot length behind the bells, feet the appropriate width for 2 bells, foot angle the appropriate width so that the knees continue to track the toes. Hinge and load toward the heels, grab the floor with the feet, tip the bells, shoulder blades are unshrugged, big belly breath, and zip. My front squat is a great place to start. Notice I'm not dipping very rapidly. That's important to consider when you're doing the dip for a push press. It's about a quarter squat. Eventually you can add a little drive to it. So it's dip, drive, recatch. But note, the dip is not that fast. The dip is slow and controlled. But the drive is immediate and fast. So if I dip too quickly, my bells are going to stay up here, and I'm going to end up dipping out from under them, and then on my way back up, I'm going to crash into them and get this sort of rebound effect that's likely to push the bells out of position when I'm trying to get them straight overhead. That's the reason for the slower dip. But when I hit the bottom position of my quarter squat or third squat, if you like to use a little extra leg drive, I'm not going to hang out down there, because the other benefit of the dip is stretch reflex. When I squat partially into the bottom, if I stop here, I'm going to lose that stretch energy that comes from the fascial system. If I dip and drive immediately, I'm going to capitalize on that stretch reflex and be able to deliver a lot of force into the bells to help me get them locked out overhead. If you know where you're going with the dip, and you know the lockout position of your double press, then you're ready to push press. We don't need to complicate it any more than that. Down with control is a great option if you're working towards a stronger strict press. Down with relaxation in the catch is a great way to go if you're just looking for a huffy puffy training session. You're not going to end up using a lot of muscular tension in the triceps and lats as you do on an active negative, but you're still going to get that aerobic training going on. Your cardiopulmonary conditioning is going to be trained just as well, but you'll be safer because you won't fatigue these muscles that are synergists to your press. There's another variation of the push press called the Viking push press, which we would do specifically with lighter bells and higher volume. In this variation, the catch of one rep is the dip of the next. And so the timing's a little bit complicated. With light bells, we can practice that reactivity without posing a tremendous risk. With heavier bells, it might be a little bit more risky, so go light to start off with. But here's the Viking push press. Dip drive. And just like the seesaw press, where you don't know when to stop, that's the case with the Viking push press as well, because your body gets used to driving out of every dip. So how do you know when you're done with your set? Well, a good rule of thumb in general is to go to a comfortable stop. You don't want to grind the last couple reps of your set. You want to stop when you've got some gas in the tank, some reps in reserve. 2 to 3 reps in reserve is a good way to go if you're lifting a sort of moderate weight. 1 or 2 reps left in the tank is a good way to go if you're going heavy. Now, if you're doing a fairly maximum effort, you're not necessarily going to have a whole rep left in the tank. But maximum efforts should be reserved for wide intervals, maybe once every 2 to 3 months, if that. You're going to get a lot more training effect out of practicing near maximal or moderate submaximal loads more frequently than truly maximal loads. So that's the dip and drive covered. Now you can leave it at that if you like, but I tend to program a special variation of the push press called the long push press. The long push press is simply a full squat into a push press. It's not stronger than a push press. So even though it's got a full squat, that's actually stealing stretch reflex from you and stealing your potential energy. So it's a great way to improve your toughness and your ability to produce strength out of the bottom of a squat, but it's not great for lifting a heavier weight overhead. You're better off with a true push press than a long push press for that. So here's the long push press. We already know the push press and we know the front squat. This is simply putting them together. backswing and park. The great thing about the long push press is it teaches you very well one of our action principles, one of our instant strength principles, which is compensatory acceleration. You're trying to move the weight through the range of motion as fast as you can. Now, you don't want to have a big bounce at the top. If that's the case, the weights probably aren't significant enough, or your control is lacking. You want to be able to slow down just before your lockout to make sure that there's no floppiness going on. But you'll notice when I perform that long push press, out of the bottom, I'm going, but I'm not going as fast as I can yet. That's for the middle third of the lift. Right after I get started, about here, to when my hips lock out, I'm really putting the pedal to the metal. That snappy, glute-crushing lockout, boom, assures that I'm going to be launching the bells overhead. I won't have to do much pressing. Maybe the top third of the range of motion or the top half of the range of motion is arm drive, but the rest is building momentum from the lower body, from that explosive hip extension. For that reason, the long push press is a great drill to practice alongside your regular push press, because it's going to give you that idea of accelerating the drive phase. The Viking push press is also a good drill to practice alongside your regular push press because it gives you an idea of how the fascial system works and how you can use spring instead of muscle to accrue volume and a training effect. You're going to be building some resiliency in your fascia, your tendons, your ligaments, even the growth plates of the bones when you add a little bit of bounce, a little bit of spring into your training. But you've got to decide where that's going to come. You don't want to spring out of the bottom of a deadlift. You don't want to spring out of the bottom of a squat, especially if you've got some pre-existing low back or knee stuff. That spring could just result in things being rent asunder. But you do want to learn how to harness the stretch shortening cycle in order to just help prepare yourself for movement emergencies and to be a little bit tougher, a little bit more resilient. The last push press variation I want to go over is the long cycle clean and push press, different than the long push press. The long push press can be thought of as squat and push press put together. The long cycle clean and push press simply means there's a clean for every rep of the push press. Backswing and zip, only the first one comes from the floor. Gets you going like a freaking locomotive. So the long cycle is easier on the upper extremities than continuous reps of push press after you've performed one clean. You're not going to accrue as much fatigue in the upper extremities. But the long cycle is much harder in terms of general endurance, keeping your air underneath you with the clean in there each time. You'll notice that there were some pauses. I can pause in the rack. I can pause overhead. There's no other place in the movement where I can pause. So those are the places where I can hang out to recover my air, to think about what's going to happen next, and make sure that I don't screw myself up. The long cycle is definitely a toughening exercise. You can do it with strict presses, you can do it with push presses, jerks, you can do it with your natural press, wherever that happens to fall, and it will make you a harder person. Now there are one-arm variations of all of these as well. Push press, Viking push press, long push press, and long cycle clean and push press. Which might be a better place for you to start. Really, this is a little bit more advanced exercise. You want to make sure you know your front squat, your press, and especially your double kettlebell clean before you get into push pressing. Whew, and it is a smoker.